On December 2, 1941, a German reconnaissance battalion pushes through the snow-covered outskirts of the small Soviet town of Khimki, just 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. Officers huddle behind their frost-covered vehicles, raising field binoculars toward the southeast. Through the crystal-clear winter air, they can distinguish the unmistakable silhouettes of buildings on the Moscow skyline. Some even swear they can see the spires of the Kremlin itself, glinting in the pale winter sun. This is it, the closest the German army would ever come to the Soviet capital. The final edge of the Wehrmacht's ambitious thrust deep into Russia. In that frozen moment, staring through their binoculars at the prize that seemed almost within reach, these officers could not have known they were standing at the absolute peak of Germany's eastward expansion. 2 days later, on December 4th, the German offensive ground to a complete halt, and it would never restart. Within 48 hours, the hunters became the hunted. Within weeks, German forces were thrown back 100 kilometers or more, leaving behind a trail of abandoned equipment, frozen corpses, and shattered dreams of a swift victory. Among the wreckage scattered across the snow-covered plains lay hundreds of tanks, the most advanced weapons of Germany's mechanized warfare, immobilized, abandoned, or destroyed. You've probably heard the popular story, General Winter defeated the Wehrmacht. According to legend, 300 German tanks froze solid outside Moscow, victims of the brutal Russian cold. It's a simple explanation. Nature itself rising to defend the motherland, paralyzing Hitler's war machine with temperatures so severe that mighty panzers became useless blocks of frozen steel. But is this story true? Did hundreds of tanks really freeze solid before Moscow? And more importantly, if there were massive equipment losses, was Winter truly to blame? Or does the real explanation reveal a far more complex and fascinating failure? In a moment, we will uncover what truly happened to the Wehrmacht's armored forces during that catastrophic winter of 1941, examining the technical breakdowns, strategic miscalculations, and logistical nightmares that converged outside Moscow. We'll see why German engines failed to start while Soviet T-34s thundered ahead in the same Arctic conditions without difficulty. And we'll discover how one of the most powerful military machines in history was brought to its knees, not by a single cause, but by a cascade of interconnected disasters, many of them entirely preventable. The real story is far more intriguing than the myth. Let's begin. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border as part of the largest invasion force ever assembled. Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, was the culmination of Hitler's ideological and strategic ambitions. Its goal was nothing less than the total destruction of the Soviet Union. Hitler's confidence bordered on delusion. "All we have to do is kick in the door," he told his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." The German High Command expected the campaign to last no more than 6 to 8 weeks. They reassured themselves it would all be over by autumn. The Red Army, they believed, would collapse like Poland had in 1939. A Soviet state weakened by Stalin's purges and corrupted by communist ideology would crumble after the first serious blow. This assumption, this absolute conviction in a quick victory, became the Wehrmacht's original sin. It poisoned every subsequent decision, distorted every plan, and ultimately sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. For Army Group Center, tasked with advancing directly on Moscow, the first weeks seemed to confirm Hitler's prophecy. German tactical superiority was overwhelming. For Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht deployed approximately 3,398 tanks, including 972 excellent medium Panzer III models. These were sophisticated machines, the result of years of engineering refinement and combat experience in Poland and France. With well-trained crews, superb optics, and efficient radio coordination between vehicles, German armor operated with a precision the Soviets could not match in those early weeks. Massive encirclements trapped hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers. German armored spearheads thrust forward with astonishing speed, often penetrating 50 kilometers or more in a single day. Victory seemed certain, inevitable. Yet even in these early triumphs, warning signs appeared for those willing to see them. Distances were enormous, far greater than anything German logistics had ever managed in Western Europe. Soviet resistance was fierce, often fanatical. Units fought to the death rather than surrender. And most importantly, Stalin's state showed no sign of the predicted collapse. On the contrary, the Soviet system displayed a disturbing resilience, continuing to mobilize fresh forces even as German armies advanced ever deeper into Russia. Then, in mid-July, Hitler made a catastrophic strategic error. When Moscow seemed within reach, he diverted major forces southward toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. The central drive toward the Soviet capital stalled. Critical weeks slipped away. The Red Army, shaken and desperate, was given precious time to recover, reorganize, and fortify the defenses of Moscow. By the time Hitler refocused on the capital in October, summer had turned to autumn. The window for a swift victory was closing, yet German confidence remained unshaken. After all, they believed they possessed technological superiority, didn't they? Take the Panzer III, the backbone of Germany's armored forces, a 20 to 23-ton vehicle powered by a 285-horsepower Maybach HL120 TRM gasoline engine, capable of 42 km/h on roads, with a 5-man crew operating in perfect coordination. In 1941, these tanks boasted an impressive kill ratio of 6-to-1 against Soviet armor. The Panzer IV provided heavier support with its short-barreled 75mm gun. Some variants, notably the AOSF, introduced in April 1941, even featured special modifications for difficult terrain. Wider tracks, expanded from 380 to 400 mm, and ice cleats for winter operations. These adaptations showed that German engineers were not ignorant of harsh Russian conditions. But here lies the irony that would soon haunt them. They prepared for some difficulties, while ignoring others. They widened tracks, but failed to winterize their armies. They foresaw difficult terrain, but not a prolonged winter campaign. This selective preparation revealed a fundamental flaw in German planning. They prepared for difficulties within the assumption of a quick victory, not for the possibility that victory might never come quickly at all. Only 1/3 of the German army was fully motorized. The rest, including 2/3 of its artillery, still relied on horses. In a mechanized war, the Wehrmacht was moving its supplies much as Napoleon's army had 130 years earlier. As German armored spearheads raced 500–600 kilometers ahead of their starting positions, they outran their own supply system. Then came the rail gauge problem. Soviet railways used a broader gauge than the European standard. Every kilometer of captured track had to be converted before German trains could use it. Behind each rapid advance followed exhausting reconstruction work, widening the gap between frontline units and reliable supply. Army Group Center required roughly 30 supply trains per day to sustain operations, yet received far fewer. Ammunition stocks dwindled, fuel reserves shrank. When hard choices had to be made about what to send forward, commanders made what seemed the only rational decision: to prioritize fuel and ammunition for the final drive on Moscow. Winter clothing could wait. After all, the campaign would be over before winter truly set in. By October 1941, German forces prepared for what they believed would be the final, decisive blow. Operation Typhoon, the code name for the assault on Moscow, was to begin on October 2nd, involving about 1,700 tanks, backed by 4,000 artillery pieces and 549 aircraft. Moscow will fall within weeks, the Wehrmacht assured itself. The rotten building will finally collapse. At first, Typhoon seemed to fulfill those expectations. On October 7th, German pincers closed around Vyazma, trapping some 400,000 Soviet soldiers from 5 armies in a vast pocket. Within 5 days, German troops destroyed 25 rifle divisions and 5 tank brigades. Another encirclement formed near Bryansk, though many Soviet units managed to break out. These were victories of staggering scale, and German commanders allowed themselves to believe the Red Army was finally broken. Moscow lay defenseless. Final victory appeared within reach. But October 7th also brought 2 events that would change the entire trajectory of the campaign. First, it snowed. A light dusting at first, quickly melting, yet that brief snowfall followed by thaw unleashed Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian season of mud. Within days, German armor and supply columns were mired in sludge so deep that tanks disappeared up to their turrets, trucks sank to their axles, and exhausted horses collapsed and died trying to pull artillery through the morass. An advance that had been lightning fast only days before slowed to a torturous crawl. Second, near Orel and Mutsensk, along the Lysitsa River, Soviet T-34 tanks struck General Guderian's celebrated 2nd Panzer Army with shocking effectiveness. A German tank gunner later described the nightmare. "Every shot seemed a direct hit," he recalled, "but our shells simply bounced off." It was the first large-scale encounter between German troops and the T-34, and it shattered their belief in technological superiority. The Soviet tanks that were supposed to be destroyed kept advancing. Their sloped armor deflected round after round, while their 76.2mm guns proved lethally effective against German machines. For the first time, German tank crews felt something unfamiliar: doubt. Rasputitsa, the season of endless mud, held the Wehrmacht in its grip for weeks. So close to Moscow, they could hardly move at all. Supply trucks that might have delivered winter clothing stood immobilized hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Soldiers stood in the rain and wet snow, watching their opportunity slip away day by day. Then, on November 15th, the ground froze solid. Movement became possible again. The offensive could resume, but the forces that renewed the assault on Moscow bore little resemblance to the confident armies that had launched Barbarossa 5 months earlier. Continuous fighting since June had exhausted both men and machines. Tanks that had crossed half of European Russia desperately needed maintenance, spare parts, and engine overhauls, none of which they received. General Heinz Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, reported to higher headquarters that destroyed tanks had not been replaced. Fuel shortages were critical, and the situation deteriorating rapidly. Temperatures were falling. On November 5th, Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, recorded readings of 29 degrees, 20 degrees, and it was still only November. Before true winter even began, German tank crews found their vehicles would not start unless they lit fires beneath the engines to thaw the frozen lubricants. It was dangerous, time-consuming, and often suicidal, as the flames made them easy targets for Soviet artillery. But without this desperate measure, the engines simply would not turn over. Still, the offensive continued. German troops clawed forward, kilometer by agonizing kilometer, toward the goal that had obsessed Hitler since the start. By late November, the spearheads reached the outer suburbs of Moscow. On the northwestern approach, German forces occupied Krasnaya Polyana, only 29 kilometers from the Kremlin. Soon came the farthest advance at Khimki, 30 kilometers from the city center, the closest German troops would ever get. Officers with field binoculars could literally see buildings in Moscow itself. So close, tantalizingly close. But Guderian's reports from the front painted a disastrous picture. By the end of November, he informed High Command that his 2nd Panzer Army, which had started the operation with about 1,000 tanks, now had only 150 operational, 15% of its strength. 85% of his armored vehicles were out of action, not destroyed heroically in battle, but simply incapable of moving or fighting. Similar reports arrived from other panzer commanders. The Wehrmacht's spearhead, the instrument of Blitzkrieg, was coming apart. On December 4th, the German advance stopped. Not because of a deliberate pause to regroup or a tactical maneuver, but because the army simply no longer had the power to move forward even one more kilometer. The trap was closing, not around Moscow, but around the Wehrmacht itself. At the beginning of December 1941, the temperature plunged. German commanders later reported truly extreme figures. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock claimed that on November 30th the mercury dropped to 45 degrees C, while General Erhard Raus recorded between 36 and 38 degrees C from December 4th to 7. Official Soviet meteorological data were slightly milder, around 28.8 degrees C for December, but the difference only reflected conditions. German officers were exposed in open fields, while Soviet readings came from sheltered stations. Whatever the exact number, one fact is beyond dispute. The winter of 1941-42 was the coldest of the entire 20th century. Temperatures reached levels that would have challenged any army, even one properly prepared. The German army was not. For the panzer crews, the cold turned their advanced machines into prisons of frozen steel. Each morning began with the same desperate ritual, building fires beneath the tanks to warm the engines. Without this, lubricants remained solidified, too thick to flow, and engines refused to turn. Crews spent hours each day just trying to start their vehicles, burning precious fuel not to move toward their objectives, but simply to keep engines alive. Meanwhile, Soviet T-34 crews used compressed air starters, specially designed to operate at 30 degrees Celsius and below. These systems worked flawlessly even as German tanks stood motionless. Compressed air eliminated the need for electrical ignition, batteries that quickly died in the extreme cold, allowing diesel engines to start even when gasoline would have frozen solid. Day after day, the Germans discovered that technical sophistication meant nothing when the technology was designed for the wrong environment. Consider the fate of the Panzer 35T, a Czech-built tank serving in several German divisions, including the 6th Panzer. Technically advanced, it featured pneumatic steering and gear shifting systems, cutting edge in 1938 when it was built in Czechoslovakia. In the Russian winter, those pneumatic systems became a death sentence. As temperatures fell, the pressurized mechanisms froze solid. Tanks could neither steer nor change gear. By November 30th, every Panzer 35 T on the Eastern Front was classified as non-operational, not destroyed in combat, not out of fuel, but simply unable to function because the cold had seized their controls. The 6th Panzer Division lost half its complement within 6 months. Performance in cold weather was so catastrophic that the entire 35 Ta class was withdrawn from frontline service by early 1942. An entire generation of tanks had been defeated, not by enemy fire, but by temperature. The crisis spread far beyond armor. Small arms froze, machine guns jammed, artillery mechanisms seized, gun oil thickened to the consistency of glue, rifle bolts refused to move. German soldiers resorted to desperate measures, wiping all oil and grease from their weapons entirely. It prevented freezing, but friction quickly wore out the metal. A rifle that burned out after 1,000 rounds was still better than one that wouldn't fire at all. Even the Luftwaffe was grounded. Aircraft engines suffered the same fate as tanks. Hydraulic fluids thickened, fuel lines froze. German air superiority, so decisive in earlier campaigns, vanished as planes sat motionless on icy runways, while Soviet aircraft, designed and serviced for Arctic conditions, continued to fly. And then there were the men themselves. German soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms in December 1941, facing 30 degrees Celsius and lower. This was not an accident of logistics. It was the direct result of that fatal assumption made back in June, that the campaign would end before winter arrived. The human cost appeared in horrifying statistics. Medical units reported over 130,000 cases of frostbite among German troops during the Battle of Moscow. Some sources list 250,000 frostbite casualties throughout the entire winter campaign. Roughly 20,000 amputations were performed. Fingers, toes, hands, feet, even limbs lost to the cold. Many soldiers simply froze to death at their posts, not killed by bullets or shells, but by exposure to temperatures their bodies and uniforms could not endure. They drifted into unconsciousness as their warmth ebbed away, their hearts eventually stopping in the silence of the snow. Morale collapsed when troops realized no winter clothing was coming. The gear they needed to survive lay stockpiled in Poland, delayed in favor of ammunition and fuel for an offensive that had already failed. Let's examine why German tanks broke down where Soviet tanks thrived. The differences were both simple and profound. German tanks used gasoline engines. Gasoline thickens and can even freeze at low temperatures. Soviet T-34s used diesel engines, less volatile and more cold-resistant. And the Soviets had developed special fuel blends for extreme cold. German engines relied on electric starters powered by batteries, which lost most of their capacity in sub-zero weather. Soviet tanks, again, used compressed air starters, unaffected by cold. German lubricants were formulated for mild European climates, perhaps 15 degrees Celsius or 20 degrees Celsius at best, while Soviet lubricants were rated for 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. When temperatures dropped below 35 degrees Celsius in late November, German oils simply stopped behaving as liquids. They congealed into heavy grease, then wax, then nearly solid paraffin. Rubber seals, hoses, and gaskets became brittle and cracked. Cooling systems froze and burst. Ice built up on tracks, reducing traction and mobility. The T-34, by contrast, embodied an entirely different design philosophy. It was simple. Fewer complex systems meant fewer failures. It was engineered from the ground up for Russian conditions. Its wide tracks distributed weight over snow and mud, improving mobility on ice. Its crews were trained for winter operations, knowing how to service their machines in extreme cold. Soviet soldiers wore proper winter uniforms, felt boots, fur hats, insulated coats. While German troops froze, Soviet forces operated in their natural element. They even wore white camouflage, a simple tactical advantage that, according to German reports, became a nightmare for Wehrmacht troops watching ghostly figures emerge from the snow. The technical collapse was total. By the end of November, Guderian's report of only 150 operational tanks out of 1,000 marked a catastrophic reduction in fighting power, achieved without the Red Army even needing a major battle. The Wehrmacht was defeating itself through equipment that could not function in the environment where Germany had chosen to fight. The contrast was undeniable. German technology, so brilliant in France and Poland, failed in Russia, while the crude and inferior Soviet machines worked exactly as designed. Was this catastrophe inevitable? Did Germany truly not realize how cold Russian winters could be? That is what makes the Wehrmacht's failure so extraordinary. It was entirely preventable. It was not ignorance. German planners knew about the severity of Russian winters. They had access to climatological data, historical records, and even detailed accounts of Napoleon's disastrous 1812 campaign. Moreover, as we saw earlier, some Panzer IV models, notably the AOS FAS-F, rolling off assembly lines in April 1941, just 2 months before Barbarossa, featured winter modifications, wider tracks, ice cleats, altered drive wheels and idlers to improve cold weather performance. German engineers clearly anticipated winter conditions. The modifications prove it. Yet Germany did not prepare comprehensively for winter operations, because its entire strategic planning assumed there would be no winter operations. Victory was supposed to come quickly, certainly before the first serious snowfall. To prepare 3.5 million men for winter warfare would have meant admitting that the campaign might last into winter. and within Hitler's Wehrmacht, such doubts were politically unacceptable. When that assumption collapsed, when October turned to November and Moscow still stood defiant, German logistics faced an unsolvable dilemma. Limited transport capacity meant hard choices. What should move forward? Ammunition and fuel for continued offensives, or winter clothing to protect the troops? The decision was made to prioritize ammunition and fuel. It seemed logical at the time. One more push, one last offensive, and Moscow would fall. The soldiers could endure a few more weeks of discomfort. Once the city fell, they could prepare for winter at leisure behind fortified lines. And so, winter clothing remained piled in warehouses in Poland, while trains carried shells and gasoline to the front. The soldiers advancing toward Moscow did so wearing the same light uniforms they had worn in June, clothing suited for plus 110 degrees Celsius, not 30 degrees Celsius. The irony runs deep. Some preparation existed, a few modified panzers, limited quantities of cold-weather gear produced in small numbers. But without a systematic, army-wide winterization effort, these scattered measures meant nothing. It was like waterproofing the bow of a ship while leaving the stern open to the sea. By late December 1941, the situation had become so catastrophic that even the Nazi regime could no longer conceal it from the German public. On December 27th, Joseph Goebbels launched an emergency campaign to collect winter clothing for the troops. His appeal to the German people was both dramatic and desperate. As long as there remains a single piece of winter clothing at home, it must go to the front. The campaign ran from December 27, 1941 to January 4, 1942. German citizens responded generously, donating more than 76 million items of winter gear: coats, scarves, gloves, boots, blankets. To be exact, 86,232,88 articles. The mere necessity of this campaign was a tacit admission of a colossal planning failure. The Wehrmacht, the force that had conquered most of Europe, could not even supply its soldiers with proper winter clothing. Instead, it begged civilians at home to give up their personal belongings to save the army from freezing. And even this vast collection effort came too late for those already freezing before Moscow. By the time the donations reached the Eastern Front, the Battle of Moscow was effectively over. The contrast with Soviet preparedness could not have been more striking. Soviet troops were issued winter uniforms: fur-lined coats, felt boots, padded jackets, ushankas. Their equipment was designed specifically for Russian winters because Russian winters were their expected theater of operations. Soviet troops trained in cold weather. Soviet factories produced lubricants rated for 40 degrees Celsius. Soviet tactical doctrine treated winter operations as normal, not exceptional. Germany had the resources, industrial capacity, and engineering expertise to prepare for winter warfare. It chose not to, because doing so would have implied doubt in a swift victory, and doubt was forbidden. The frozen tanks before Moscow, the 130,000 frostbite cases, the soldiers dying not from bullets, but from exposure. All of it was not the work of nature, but the direct result of human decisions based on catastrophic overconfidence. Nature did not defeat the Wehrmacht before Moscow. The Wehrmacht defeated itself by refusing to prepare for conditions it fully understood. While German officers stared through their binoculars toward Moscow, convinced that the Red Army was nearly finished, the Soviets were preparing the largest and fastest military mobilization in human history. In popular imagination, the salvation of Moscow is often attributed to the legendary Siberian divisions. According to this famous tale, Stalin, informed by Soviet spy Richard Sorge in Tokyo that Japan would not attack the USSR, transferred elite battle-hardened troops from the Far East to defend the capital. It's a compelling narrative. Veterans from the frozen wastes of Siberia, perfectly adapted to winter warfare, arriving to turn the tide against freezing Germans. But as with many myths of the war, the truth is more nuanced. Between June and December 1941, The Soviets indeed transferred 28 divisions from the Far East and Siberia to the West. Yet analysis of their actual composition reveals a different reality. Of the 14 divisions moved after August, only 3 rifle divisions contained a significant number of Siberians. Only 2 of those actually defended the western approaches to Moscow. Many of these so-called Siberian divisions had only begun forming in March or April 1941. Far from being hardened veterans, they were barely trained recruits. The real Soviet advantage lay elsewhere, in unprecedented mass mobilization. By the end of 1941, the Soviet Union had created 182 newly mobilized rifle divisions, plus 43 militia divisions and 8 tank divisions, the fastest expansion of armed forces in recorded history. Despite losing millions of men and vast territories in the opening months, the Soviet system was creating new armies faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. During the Battle of Moscow alone, the Red Army fielded 75 fresh divisions, while the Germans received none. German formations, reduced to fractions of their original strength, were forced to keep fighting without reinforcements. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders could rely on what seemed like endless reserves. In the first half of November, the Western Front defending Moscow received 100,000 men, 300 tanks, and 2,000 artillery pieces, all freshly supplied and properly equipped. Exactly what the Germans lacked. By early December, the Wehrmacht was exhausted. Its troops had been fighting continuously for 5 months, pushing to distances that strained every logistical system beyond breaking. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army had lost 85% of its armor to mechanical failure, fuel shortages, and cold. Soldiers froze in summer uniforms. Ammunition stocks were critically low. The Red Army, in contrast, had achieved overwhelming local superiority, thanks to its massive mobilization, shorter supply lines, and the advantage of home territory. While the Germans fought at the far end of impossibly long supply routes, Soviet forces under General Georgy Zhukov, the defender of Moscow, launched a counter-offensive on December 5-6, 1941. The attack came as a complete surprise. German intelligence had assessed the Red Army as nearly destroyed, incapable of large-scale offensive operations. Instead, several Soviet fronts struck simultaneously across hundreds of kilometers. T-34 tanks, the same that had stunned the Germans at Mtsensk, now surged forward in massive waves. Katyusha rocket launchers, the dreaded Stalin's organs, rained devastating salvos on German positions. And from the snow emerged Soviet infantry in white camouflage, appearing like ghosts, sowing panic among frostbitten German soldiers whose weapons jammed in the cold. The Wehrmacht could not respond effectively. Tanks refused to start, artillery mechanisms froze, and the men themselves were too weakened by cold and hunger to mount a counterattack. German units that only weeks earlier had been within sight of the Kremlin now began to retreat. The withdrawal quickly degenerated into chaos. In some sectors, according to Soviet accounts, retreat turned into panic. German formations abandoned vehicles and heavy weapons they could neither move nor defend. At Klin, entire divisions left behind most of their heavy equipment during emergency evacuations. Advancing Soviet troops captured artillery systems, still intact, that the Germans had simply been forced to abandon for lack of ammunition or towing vehicles. On December 8th, Hitler ordered an end to all offensive operations on the entire Eastern Front. The great offensive that was to end with the fall of Moscow and the destruction of the Soviet Union had been stopped and reversed. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was in retreat. The scale of German material losses in December was staggering. Records show the loss of 983 artillery pieces, 473 heavy mortars, 800 anti-tank guns, and hundreds of tanks, destroyed in battle, abandoned during the retreat, or immobilized and left behind. Exact tank losses vary among sources, but some numbers are well documented. Over 700 tanks were destroyed or abandoned during the second phase of Operation Typhoon, even before the Soviet counteroffensive began. As the retreat unfolded through December, losses climbed even higher. The Wehrmacht's armored superiority, so decisive in the early months of the campaign, evaporated. Soviet numerical dominance, combined with equipment that actually functioned in winter, now ruled the battlefield. The hunters had become the hunted, and winter was only beginning. As German troops fell back, their commanders faced the same impossible questions. Where to stop? How to prevent retreat from turning into collapse? How to save an army freezing, starving, and under attack? An army told it was on the brink of victory. On December 18, 1941, Adolf Hitler gave his answer. Hold fast at all costs. The directive was absolute. German forces were to defend their current positions regardless of Soviet breakthroughs on the flanks or in the rear. No withdrawals were to be permitted under any circumstances. Commanders were personally ordered to enforce fanatical resistance. 2 days later, Hitler told General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, "Our watchword is the fanatical will to defend every inch of ground." It was an order born of desperation and ideology. Hitler feared that any retreat would turn into uncontrollable collapse, a repeat of Napoleon's army's disintegration in 1812. He believed that sheer willpower could overcome material failure, and perhaps he also knew that there were no prepared defensive positions to fall back on. German planning for a short campaign meant no winter defensive lines had ever been built. The reactions of field commanders revealed the impossible situation they faced. General Heinz Guderian, the brilliant panzer commander whose theories had revolutionized armored warfare, received Hitler's order to stand and die with a bitter awareness of reality. By late November, he already knew he could not extract his army from its position. His troops were surrounded by enemies, immobilized by weather, and crippled by mechanical failures. Supplies were nearly gone. To stand fast could mean annihilation, but retreating under Soviet pressure might mean annihilation even faster. On Christmas Day, December 25, 1941, Guderian made his final attempt to resist the directive. He informed his superiors that he would not transmit Hitler's order to his troops, even under threat of a court-martial. Within hours, he was relieved of command. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge replaced him, tasked with enforcing Hitler's order. But von Kluge, a pragmatic commander, interpreted the directive with crucial flexibility. He told his subordinates that positions should not be held if doing so meant destruction. This creative interpretation, obeying the spirit of the order while allowing tactical withdrawals when necessary, saved countless German units from encirclement and destruction. Lower-level officers followed von Kluge's example. Some retreated under cover of darkness and reported that they were merely realigning their front lines. Others described withdrawals as corrective repositioning. In reality, these quiet acts of defiance preserved what remained of the army. The survival of the German forces that winter owed far more to pragmatic disobedience than to Hitler's ideological fanaticism. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the stand-fast order. The traditional narrative, often promoted in post-war German memoirs, credits Hitler's stubbornness with preventing total collapse. Without his command, they argued, the retreat might have turned into a full-scale rout. But modern scholarship tells a more nuanced story. Historian David Stahel, in his 2019 analysis Retreat from Moscow, argues that the order actually worsened the crisis. He points to divisions that suffered the fewest losses, those that ignored Hitler's directive and conducted organized withdrawals to defensible positions. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, retreating against orders, reached new defensive lines earlier and with fewer casualties than units that tried to hold open positions. It was the generals, not Hitler, who saved the Wehrmacht in the winter of 1941-42. Field commanders who made practical decisions in defiance of ideological commands preserved enough strength to stabilize the front. By early January 1942, German troops had been pushed back 100 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The retreat finally stabilized, but at a terrible cost. German losses in the Battle of Moscow ranged from 250,000 to 400,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Soviet losses were even higher, between 600,000 and 1.3 million. But while the Red Army could replenish its ranks through continuing mobilization, Germany could not. Across the snow-covered fields between Moscow and the new German lines lay the wreckage of defeat. Frozen corpses, abandoned guns, and hundreds of tanks. The pride of Germany's mechanized warfare, left behind during the catastrophic retreat. So, we return to the central question. Did 300 German tanks freeze solid outside Moscow? After extensive examination, the truth becomes clear. No verified historical source supports that exact number. The figure of 300 frozen tanks likely arose from popular simplification. Perhaps confusion with other battles, such as Kursk in 1943, or misinterpretation of individual unit losses that later entered popular mythology. Yet while the precise figure may be uncertain, the broader story it represents is absolutely true. Hundreds of German tanks were lost before Moscow, to combat, to mechanical failure, to cold, to fuel shortages, and to abandonment during the retreat. Let's establish what we can confirm with confidence. Operation Typhoon began on October 2, 1941, with roughly 1,700 tanks. During the second phase alone, even before the Soviet counteroffensive, the Germans lost over 700 tanks, destroyed or abandoned. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army suffered catastrophic attrition. 85% of its armor non-operational, a collapse in fighting strength that required no major Soviet battle. Entire categories of German tanks were rendered useless by temperature alone. Every Panzer 35T became non-functional. An entire model of fighting vehicle was withdrawn, not because of enemy action, but because of cold. During the December retreat, German units abandoned heavy equipment across multiple sectors. At Klin, retreating divisions left behind most of their artillery during emergency evacuation. Soviet reports after the battle describe advancing Red Army forces capturing intact German guns, simply left where they stood because there was no fuel, no horses, and no time. The exact number of tanks abandoned in December is not documented precisely, but we know it was widespread. Why were they left behind? The reasons were many and interconnected. Combat losses from the Soviet counterattack, mechanical failure after 5 months of continuous use, frozen engines and lubricants, fuel shortages as supply lines collapsed. As we've seen, a tank that wouldn't start became a static bunker, and a bunker cannot retreat. German crews were often forced to destroy their own vehicles to prevent capture. Some were blown up with demolition charges, others set ablaze. Some were simply left behind, the crews hoping the cold would make them useless to the enemy. But not all abandoned tanks were destroyed. Soviet troops captured many German machines intact, putting some back into service or studying them to learn German engineering strengths and weaknesses. The abandoned equipment wasn't concentrated in a single, frozen graveyard outside Moscow. It was scattered over hundreds of kilometers of snow-covered fields and forests, frozen monuments to a failed campaign. When spring came and the snow melted, the scale of the catastrophe was revealed. Rusting panzer hulls dotted the landscape, silent witnesses to the furthest reach of the Wehrmacht's advance eastward. For decades, German officers and historians repeated the same convenient explanation. We were not defeated by the Russians. We were defeated by General Winter. It was a phrase that became myth, repeated so often that it hardened into collective memory. The image was irresistible. Heroic German soldiers brought low not by enemy skill, but by nature itself, by the merciless cold of the Russian steppe. It allowed post-war memoirists to preserve their pride and shift the blame. The elements became a scapegoat. But history tells a very different story. Winter did not defeat the Wehrmacht. Winter merely exposed everything that was already broken. The arrogance, the logistical neglect, and the fatal underestimation of the Soviet Union. The myth of General Winter survives because it contains a kernel of truth. Yes, the winter was brutal, the coldest in a century. But that same winter was endured by Soviet troops, who not only survived but counterattacked, advanced, and won. The difference was preparation. To understand what truly defeated Germany before Moscow, we must strip away the legend and look at the 5 real forces that brought down Hitler's war machine. 1. Strategic overconfidence. At the heart of Germany's defeat was an illusion, the belief that the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. This assumption dictated every logistical, industrial, and tactical decision made before June 1941. The Wehrmacht planned a campaign of 8 weeks, not a war of attrition. No contingency existed for failure, no plan for a winter front. As one German general later admitted, "We prepared everything for a victory, nothing for a prolonged war." When the Soviet Union refused to collapse, the entire plan disintegrated. The Germans had raced to Moscow without the means to stay there. 2. Logistical breakdown. From the moment the invasion began, logistics lagged behind ambition. The German army advanced faster than its supply system could follow. Fuel shortages began as early as August 1941, long before winter arrived. Supply lines stretched across 1,000 kilometers of wrecked railways, each requiring gauge conversion. Horse-drawn wagons, the same technology used in 1812, struggled through the mud of Rasputitsa. When the ground froze, the horses died. When the horses died, the artillery stopped. When the artillery stopped, the front collapsed. In the end, winter only froze in place what logistical failure had already begun. 3. Mechanical and technical unpreparedness. The German army entered the Soviet Union with superior weapons, but weapons optimized for Western Europe. The Panzer III and I-4, the pride of the Wehrmacht, were precision machines designed for paved roads and temperate climates. In Russia, they met mud, dust, and temperatures of 40 degrees. Complex engines with fine tolerances seized, pneumatic controls froze, lubricants solidified. Meanwhile, the Soviet T-34, simpler, rougher, less sophisticated, proved invincible in the same environment. Its wide tracks, sloped armor, and diesel engine made it not only effective in battle, but also reliable in weather that paralyzed German machines. In a war of endurance, reliability is the true measure of superiority. By that standard, the Germans had already lost. 4. Industrial and doctrinal rigidity. German industry in 1941 lacked the flexibility of the Soviet system. Whereas Soviet factories adapted rapidly to new demands, moving entire industrial complexes east of the Urals and resuming production within weeks, German production remained compartmentalized, slow, and over-engineered. The Soviets could field crude but effective weapons in massive numbers. Germany produced masterpieces of engineering, but too few, too delicate, too late. The same rigidity plagued military doctrine. German generals were tactically brilliant, but strategically trapped within a short war mentality. They had perfected the art of the Blitzkrieg, but had no answer when the lightning faded and the storm dragged on. 5. Soviet mobilization and willpower. Perhaps the greatest German miscalculation was psychological. They underestimated the Soviet Union's ability to absorb losses and keep fighting. Between June and December 1941, the Red Army suffered millions of casualties and still rebuilt entire armies from scratch. Factories dismantled in Ukraine and Belarus were reassembled in the Urals. Within months, new tanks, guns, and aircraft rolled off assembly lines deep in Siberia. Behind the front, an entire nation had transformed into a war machine powered by desperation. While Germany relied on a limited industrial base and foreign labor, the Soviet Union drew upon the full mobilization of its people. The result was not just replacement of losses, it was expansion of strength. As one captured German officer later remarked, "We thought we had defeated them by September. By December, they had replaced everything and added more." The collapse of the myth. So when we hear that 300 German tanks froze before Moscow, the truth is deeper. Yes, tanks froze, engines failed, thousands of men died from cold. But those were symptoms, not causes. They were the physical manifestations of deeper structural flaws. Had the Wehrmacht prepared for winter, those tanks would have started. Had they planned for logistics, those tanks would have been refueled. Had they anticipated resistance, they might not have been stranded in the snow outside Moscow at all. Winter did not destroy the Wehrmacht. Hubris did. The German failure before Moscow marked a turning point, not only in the campaign, but in the entire Second World War. For the first time, Hitler's armies were forced to retreat. The aura of invincibility surrounding the Wehrmacht, the myth of the unstoppable Blitzkrieg, was shattered forever. The Soviet Union had survived the most powerful military assault in history, and survival in 1941 meant eventual victory. The frozen tanks outside Moscow still stand in Russian soil today, silent relics, half buried in snow, rusted and skeletal. They are not monuments to the cold, nor to general winter. They are monuments to overconfidence, arrogance, and miscalculation. Steel defeated not by temperature, but by ideology. And behind every wreck lies the story of a campaign that sought to conquer a continent and froze halfway to its goal. When the snow finally melted in the spring of 1942, the fields west of Moscow revealed the silent aftermath of one of the most decisive turning points in modern history. Scattered across the landscape lay the skeletal remains of panzer divisions, rusted hulls half buried in thawing mud, collapsed trenches filled with shattered helmets, burned-out trucks, and frozen artillery pieces. The road to Moscow, once the proud highway of Blitzkrieg, had become a graveyard of ambition. For the men who survived, the memory of that winter would haunt them for the rest of their lives. German soldiers who endured the snow described it later with one word: Hölle, hell. Those who froze but lived through it carried lifelong scars, frostbite amputations, and the knowledge that their suffering came not from enemy genius, but from the blindness of their own leadership. The frozen front was not a triumph of nature. It was a failure of reason. The price of hubris. Every empire believes its power is eternal until the moment it shatters. For Hitler's Reich, that moment came not in Stalingrad nor in Normandy, but before the gates of Moscow in the winter of 1941. The failure to capture the Soviet capital broke the illusion of invincibility. From that point onward, Germany would fight not to win a world empire, but merely to delay its inevitable collapse. Behind the myth of General Winter lies a simpler and more devastating truth. The Wehrmacht froze because it refused to prepare. It ignored logistics, underestimated the enemy, and believed ideology could replace planning. The defeat before Moscow was not just a military setback, it was a psychological turning point. For the first time, German officers began to doubt the Führer's infallibility. For the first time, the Red Army, bloodied, battered, but unbroken, understood that the enemy could be stopped. The human cost. The human toll of Operation Barbarossa remains almost incomprehensible. Between June and December 1941, over 3 million Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, and millions of civilians perished in the wake of the invasion. German casualties reached nearly $750,000 by the end of the year, dead, wounded, or missing. Yet behind each number lay a human face. Young men from Bavaria, Saxony, Siberia, and the Urals, all consumed by the same machine of total war. No amount of ideology could disguise the reality that this was not a clash of races or systems. It was a struggle of endurance, fought by ordinary men under inhuman conditions. The legacy of the frozen tanks. The rusted tanks outside Moscow became more than just war relics. They became symbols. In post-war Germany, they embodied the myth of General Winter, a comforting illusion that preserved the dignity of defeat. In the Soviet Union, they stood as icons of resilience, proof that even the mightiest invaders could be broken by courage, unity, and patience. To this day, in Russian war museums and memorial sites, one can see panzer hulls encased in frost, displayed beside the indomitable T-34, the tank that not only survived winter, but turned it into an ally. Each frozen panzer tells the same silent story, of arrogance meeting reality, of precision engineering defeated by simplicity, and of men who believed they could bend history to their will, only to be buried beneath it. The lesson endures. The Battle of Moscow did not end the war, but it ended the dream of a short one. It proved that technological superiority means nothing without logistics, that bravery cannot replace planning, and that hubris is the deadliest enemy of all. It also revealed the hidden power of resilience, the capacity of a nation, when cornered, to rebuild itself from ashes and snow. In the words of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who orchestrated the defense and counterattack, they believed they would conquer Russia in a few months. They forgot that Russia is not conquered by speed. Only by endurance can one survive her. Eternal winter. Today, the fields around Moscow are green again. Villages rebuilt, forests regrown, highways paved over the same ground where frozen columns once stood. But beneath the soil still lie fragments of steel, twisted armor plates, rusted tracks, shattered gun barrels. They remain as quiet witnesses, whispering a single, timeless warning to every generation that follows. No power, however great, survives when it refuses to learn humility. Because in the end, it was not General Winter who defeated the Wehrmacht. It was General Reality.